Hello, I'm Elizabeth Oldfield. I am the director of Theos. And in a moment, I'll be introducing my colleagues, Paul Bickley and Nathan Mladin, who are our report author. And they'll be sharing some of the findings from the report that you're here to hear about. We'll then hand over to our very eminent panelists, who we're thrilled to welcome this evening. Janet Daby MP, who is, amongst other things, is the Labour Shadow Face Minister. Tony Travers, who is the director of the Institute of Public Affairs at the LSE, one of the country's foremost experts on cities and local government, and Mustafa Field, who is the director of the Face Forum for London. They have long and very impressive CVs, but in the age of Google, I thought you could probably go and read about those yourself. And I'm going to hand over now to Paul Bickley, who is the co-author of the report, who's going to lay out some of the findings.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen here. Excellent. As Liz said, my name's Paul Bickley. I'm the research fellow at Theos and the co-author of the report with Nathan Mladin. I'm going to take you through some of the data headlines before handing over to Nathan, who will be leading with the qualitative findings. Before I start, I just wanted to say a word of thanks. This has been even more of a team effort than usual. Thanks to the team at Theos for their brilliant work around launching this report, in particular in difficult circumstances. Lots of people have also contributed during the process. I just want to particularly mention former colleagues Amy Plender and Hannah Eves, who carried out some of the research interviews. Thanks also to Savanta Comrades, who we worked with for the data collection. Their support has been vital during this project. And we also want to thank the Mercer's Company, who generously supported this research and without whom it wouldn't have been possible. So why did we embark on this project, Religious London? Well, the postponed election would have marked 20 years since the advent of the office of Mayor for London, and the London Assembly would have been a forward-looking election. Little did we know what kind of spring it would be, but our question is, have politicians and policymakers in London fully grappled with the challenges and opportunities of leading such a religiously diverse city? That's why we're not just looking at the demographic questions, how many religious people are there, but we're also looking at their social and political values. Behind this project lies a series of conversations with colleagues and fellow travellers. Grace Davies' report for Theos in 2017, that's Religion in Public Life, Levelling the Ground, had a whole section on London as an exception. We had a really compelling conversation with Ben Judah around his book, This is London, and others have encouraged us along the way with their own insights, including Professor Tony Travers, who is here with us tonight, and David Goodhue. Beyond that, it is one of our long-standing goals at Theos to understand the processes of secularization and indeed desecularization, and London is, of course, a fascinating case study. So let's dig into these findings. We ran simultaneous polls with Savanta Comrades, one in London and one national, to get the comparative data. So there are two sets of data tables for anybody who wants to dig deeper, and they're available on Savanta's website or on ours. The most obvious finding is that London, by proportion of population, is more religious than the rest of the country. 62% in London say they have a religion, compared to only 53% in the rest of the country. Religion in London also looks very different. For instance, very obviously there, the proportion of non-Christian religious is much higher in London, and a substantial part of that is, of course, the Muslim population in London, and we know that 1 in 8 Londoners are Muslim approximately. The mix of Christian denominations, furthermore, is very different. The Catholic Church here is the largest denomination in London, and Pentecostal and Orthodox churches have a much more substantial presence than elsewhere in the country. London, as it happens, is also the least Anglican place in England. London has the lowest proportion of the so-called religious nons, that is people who say they have no religious affiliation. And actually looking at other data, BSA data, British Social Attitude Survey data, you can see that the religious nons in London are more ambivalent. They are less likely to say that they're extremely or very non-religious compared to the non-religious in other regions. Religious Londoners are an extremely ethnically diverse group, so 48% of religious Londoners are BAME, while around 27% of non-religious Londoners are BAME. Christianity in particular was significantly more ethnically diverse in the capital. 31% of Christians in London are BAME versus 2% in this data, at least, across the rest of Britain, excluding London. Now, I'm sure that people in the Q&A later will want to ask about trends. Can I just preempt that a little? This is not trend data. Trend data is available elsewhere in other data sets, and we cover a little of that in the report. We look at things like the Labour Force Survey or the British Social Attitude Survey. So far as we have, I would say that the overall number of Christians in London has declined slightly over the past couple of decades, but probably declined more as a proportion of London's growing population. London's Muslim population, however, has grown from just over 700,000 in 2004 to 1.2 million in 2018. Hindu and Jewish populations have also grown, though these are, of course, in their absolute size, much smaller. The fastest growing group in London, however, is the religious nones, and they have added to their number about 1 million in the last decade. What is going to happen in the future? I certainly don't have an answer, and I won't be speculating on that either now or later, but I suspect a lot will depend on who leaves London after the pandemic has run its course. Will the white, relatively highly educated, more likely to be non-religious graduate group stay away or move away? Or will the global disruptions emerging from the pandemic and also Britain's departure from the EU mean that migration patterns will shift, and that the religious communities that are coming to London and renewing themselves in London continually will stop or change in those migration patterns? So that's our kind of headline findings, as it were. We also want to say that London is more religious by intensity of religious practice. So we worked with Savanta Comres to split the largest religious group, Christians, down into 3 categories: frequently practicing, infrequently practicing, and never practicing. For want of a more kind of catchy way of putting that, we've put them as NP, IP, and FP on this slide. So we see that London's Christians are more than twice as likely to be frequently practicing. That's 30% versus 13% in the rest of the country. At the other end, while more than half of Britain's Christians, excluding London and Northern Ireland, are never practicing, only 30% in London are never practicing. That is, they say they have a religious faith, but never do anything about it in terms of attending services or praying. That holds too for other religious groups, non-Christian religious groups. So if you look at the frequency of prayer in the data, 63% of other religious respondents were praying once a week or more in London, compared to 50% outside the capital. So there is a London effect in terms of this intensity of religious practice. Frequently practicing Christians, it's also worth saying, one of the youngest groups in London, along with the other religious group taken as a whole. Frequently practicing Christians are also gender balanced, whereas infrequently practicing Christians are disproportionately female, never practicing disproportionately male. I'm now going to push through some of the data on political and social values quite quickly, and there is quite a lot in the data, so I do encourage you, if you are inclined to that sort of thing, to go and look at the data tables for yourself. We do see, I think, different political sensibility amongst religious Londoners. In conventional terms, they're to the right of non-religious Londoners, though that's not uniform, but I do think it is there. So we put 3 sets of statements in the polling around economic questions, welfare questions, and then libertarian, authoritarian questions. And so in the following 3 slides, I've simply pulled out where I think there are stark or interesting differences between the groups, but we won't exhaust the kind of things that could be said here. There's a lot more that could be said. So on these economic questions, you see I've highlighted there a statement: the best way to tackle poverty is by generating wealth through strong business and private enterprise. So we found that religious Londoners were far more likely to agree with that statement than non-religious Londoners. I think, though, that this statement commands higher support than perhaps many people would have anticipated in London as a whole. So 53% agreeing with that. The best way to tackle poverty is by generating wealth through strong business and private enterprise. But we see a clear difference there by about 20 points between the religious and the non-religious. On this set of statements grouped around welfare, we found that religious Londoners were less likely to agree that government should provide for all vulnerable people by increasing taxes than non-religious Londoners. Note some variation in the different Christian groups here. Frequently practicing seem across some of these statements to be more consistently welfarist, but on the statement that I've highlighted, Obviously, you can see that 57% of the non-religious population said the government should provide for all vulnerable people through increasing taxes, whereas only 39% of the people in the other religious category agreed with that statement. And then on these libertarian, authoritarian questions, we saw some really stark and interesting differences. So you can see there in the first statement I've highlighted, 81% of Christians thought that schools should teach children to obey authority versus only 56% of religious nons. I've included there, though, a highlight on the environmental question. Religious nons are prepared for authoritarian or big state action on some issues. It just happens to be very different issues to the ones that the religious communities are concerned about. But also note the last statement there is quite a strong feeling that political correctness has gone too far amongst the never practicing Christian group. And I think there's something there which perhaps we could open up in the Q&A about the differences between the different Christian groups and the potential there for a kind of strongly kind of cultural Christianity having different political positions than practicing Christianity. So, as well as being politically more conservative, London is also more socially conservative. We put 5 statements in the polling around moral questions, and you can see these on the slide now. On questions like these, we know that the nation as a whole has been becoming consistently more liberal over the last 30, 40 or 50 years. But London as a whole responded consistently in a more conservative way. So 24% in London, that's London as a whole, not the religious, said that sex before marriage is at least sometimes wrong, compared to 13% in the rest of the country. There was also a fairly big margin there on the assisted suicide question. Now, this is very likely a religious effect. So you see, for instance, on this slide, on the sex before marriage question, 46% of respondents in the other religious category said that it was at least sometimes wrong, compared to only 5% of non-religious Londoners. And finally, you can see some average scores. You think of these as sort of average social conservatism scores, with 0 being liberal, 5 being conservative. And the frequently practicing group is the most conservative group. That's frequently practicing Christians. The religious nons are the least. So this isn't a regression analysis, but I think we can be clear that it's religious London which is pulling the city in a more conservative direction, or perhaps we should say more rightly, it's religious nons creating a liberal pull on the City of London, given that they are in the minority. I'm going to hand over in a moment to Nathan via Liz to talk about some of the qualitative work around relationships between civic and religious institutions. But before that, 2 concluding slides. Our data sees that religious Londoners are more civically engaged, more likely to join a political party, volunteer regularly for a charitable initiative, or make a financial donation to support a charitable cause. It's not a massive effect, but it certainly is there. But they also experience a strong sense of civic discomfort. So we put some questions around governments have passed legislation that makes life more difficult for people with beliefs like mine, and then ask whether people have experienced feeling marginalized or threatened because of their religious beliefs, background, or identity. And you could see some pretty stark finding here. So interestingly, 16% of religious nons agreed to those statements, but in the Muslim category there, which is unfortunately a smaller sample size than we can be absolutely confident about in terms of the polling, but I think you get a sense of what's going on there. And there is also an interesting effect. The net regular and net irregular are regular attendance at worship and irregular attendance at worship. Basically, the more you practice your religion, the more likely you are to feel marginalized. So although London, there's a paradox there, essentially, religious Londoners are civically engaged, but they're also experiencing a strong sense of civic discomfort. So that concludes the, I acknowledge, fairly dense presentation of the data. I'm handing back now to Liz and then Nathan.
We will swap over to Nathan in just a moment, but I really just want people to take a breath. And if you would like to put questions in the chat box, I can already see that pinging away, which is great. Maybe something that surprised you. And it's just a way of thinking as we go rather than getting completely saturated. But I'm going to hand over to Nathan now for the continuation of this presentation.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Paul. And thank you indeed all for pushing through the Zoom fatigue and joining us tonight. I've got 5 minutes or so to just give you a whistle-stop tour of the key qualitative findings. And hopefully this will add the human dimension, the lived experience layer to the very interesting stats that you've heard from Paul. Now, we set out to understand how this fascinating and complex picture of religion in London looks like in 3D, so to speak. In particular, we wanted to gauge the nature of relationships and intensity of engagement, or lack of, between religious institutions and public and civic bodies, mainly at the local borough level. We wanted to pick up on challenges and opportunities, success stories, as well as sore points. So we conducted 35 interviews in 4 different areas across London in terms of religious demography. We talked to religious and public authorities in Barking and Dagenham, but also in Hackney, in Kensington and Chelsea, as well as in Greenwich and Lewisham. And this is what we found. First, we found that faith groups are doing good, delivering a wide range of public services, building the common good, fostering cohesion and providing belonging through things like food banks, youth programs to tackle knife crime, debt and money advice, lunches for the elderly, night shelters, and the list goes on. And in fact, this fits with existing data on faith-based social action and our own previous research. But the general approach of public authorities, we found out, to faith groups was perceived to be crisis-driven and rather reactive. In times of crisis, and think of recent terrorist attacks or Grenfell, but also funding cuts to council, public authorities tend to reach out to faith communities when there's a problem. And they respond, they stand in the gap, but they report feeling more like levers to be pulled sometimes than genuine partners to be engaged with. So there was a strong feeling coming through from the religious groups wanting to be acknowledged as partners and community assets, playing a vital role in the common life of the city. We did come across quite a few examples of positive engagement between public institutions and faith groups, and this was unsurprisingly because of positive relationships between faith leaders and civic and political leaders. And that's great. The only problem or peril in that is the lack of institutional memory. Once the people in the council, for example, or in the faith communities leave, are replaced, lose an election, what have you, the relationship between the faith bodies and public institutions may suffer as a result. And I think this adds to the theme of relationships being slightly random, or to use a better term, organic and rather unplanned. Intermediary institutions or networks like faith forums and other structures like that are actually crucial for mitigating this problem and building more sustainable engagement between faith groups and public bodies. But here there are challenges and questions around how representative they really are for the diversity of religious communities, with some groups not particularly keen to engage in interfaith stuff, or some just complaining that they're talking shops and they just don't get very much done. Now, we also found out in our interviews that there are, of course, some pressure points. Pressure points around space and human sexuality. Very different things, obviously. But space, we're not the first ones to pick up on the fact that provision of space for worshiping communities is a real problem and a pressure point. And nobody's really addressing it as far as we can tell. The London and local plans, with some exceptions, focus massively on commercial and residential space, less on community spaces, and even less so on worshipping spaces for communities. And this pushes many newer religious communities into unlicensed or inadequately licensed building spaces. And as you can imagine, this is causing all sorts of problems in terms of noise, parking spaces, bins and refuse, just the crunchy problems, as my colleague Paul likes to call them, the crunchy problems at the local level. So there is a growing sense that there's a clear and growing need for space. And Paul will say a bit more what we are actually calling for in response to this. Briefly on the question of human sexuality, Paul also mentioned the real value divergence in London. The conflict between secular values and religious values shows up in the provision of public services, but more acutely in the area of education, and particularly the intersection with the topic of human sexuality. Finally, if I were to sum up some of the key obstacles in the way of better, more fruitful relationships between faith communities and public bodies, it would be poor religious literacy. And I think this shows up in many contexts, not least in contexts where people of faith, quote unquote, are lumped together as if they were all the same. And you can imagine the kind of the assumptions there. And this seems odd because the legislative framework sees religion and belief as protected characteristics. But look, this is not just a question of ignorance about religious facts and beliefs. We would say it's not even a question of diversity. It's a question of dispositions primarily. It's a question of posture, of knowing your neighbor, your religious neighbor, learning who they really are and listening well. When public institutions get this right and develop the right dispositions, I think we all collectively have a lot to gain. Thank you. And I'll now hand back to Paul.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm really eager to get onto kind of the reaction of the panelists and also conversation with the rest of the meeting. So I thought, how do I boil down our recommendations, which you can find at length in the report, to their pithiest? And I've come up with two. The first is London's politicians should do God. Of course, our current mayor does have a faith. That's not necessary for future mayors. I think our last mayor probably has probably doesn't identify as having a religious faith. But London's politicians need to take religious institutions and communities more seriously. And I think all the more so as we emerge from the pandemic and try and bring London back from all the problems it suffered. Religious communities are going to be essential parts of civil society and essential nodes of public provision. And that's so London's politicians should do God, but then London's religious leaders and communities should do politics. By that, I don't mean a kind of atavistic, self-interested politics, but engagement around work for the common good. And I think a key thing for London's religious leaders to think about is how they bring some of those new and emerging religious communities into networks of conversation, of education, and of relationship with public authorities. So what we're seeing, even in the course of conducting our own research, is that it's very easy to get to the obvious religious leaders in a locality, but we know there are very many other congregations, communities that are kind of off the radar, whether that comes to planning or whether that's purely in the sense of the relationships that a kind of local network of religious leaders would have. So London's religious communities need to work harder to bring those newer and emerging communities into that civic space. So that concludes a kind of presentation on the research. I'm really eager to hear people's responses and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul and Nathan. I'm going to hand over to Tony Travers in a minute, who is our first respondent. Tony, we're really glad to have you here.
Okay, and first of all, thank you for inviting me to be here. And what I want to do is just to say a few things about the report, a few observations really, particularly as a student of London's government and politics, and some of these issues have already been touched upon. I mean, the first thing I suppose to note is I mean, we always knew London was a radically different place to the rest of the UK, to the point where the rest of the UK occasionally gets somewhat fed up with London being so different. But now we've found, or have much clearer evidence of, yet another way in which the city is different to the rest of the UK. It's not a bad thing, it's just something else we now know about the city and about the way it's made up. In fact, London is a city we all know to be multiply diverse. The word diverse is regularly used to talk about London. And what this does, in a sense, in talking about religion, is add another element of diversity. And I totally agree with the fact that this is something politics and politicians need to think about. And the reason for that is politicians, national politicians, citywide politicians such as the Mayor and London Assembly and borough politicians do already have to think, and a national politician is going to speak later, do already think about the overlapping identities that we all now have. In time gone by, and I'll come back to this in a second, people easily identified as Conservative or Labour, few were Liberals, few nationalists, that was it. Now we have a range of identities which political parties themselves have to come to terms with, have to accommodate. And I think this report underlines the extent to which those identities include in London, and for many individuals in London, large numbers, a religious identity of a particular kind, different religions, but a religious identity which is part of their makeup. I think there is as I say, I study politics in London, have done for some time. One of the things that's intriguing, let's see if I can even deconstruct this and say it, is that the report suggests that those who are religious, and particularly those who are significantly more religious, have somewhat more, not everybody, but on average, somewhat more socially conservative views. Yet we also know that London has shifted over time to being a substantially Labour city. There are Conservative councils, of course, and members of the London Assembly, and we had famously a Conservative mayor, but over time it's become a Labour city, more of a Labour city. And this creates the fascinating curiosity that London has become a substantially more religious and therefore indirectly socially conservative place. At the same time, it's become, because I think there is a trend here, more Labour voting. And that means that the Labour Party ends up, in a sense, having to accommodate this. And the Conservative Party, which you might thought politically would be more, have more views that were small c conservative, appears not to be able to attract at least some voters who you might think they would be able to attract. So there's a sort of failure of an overlap there between some of the views identified in this study and the major political parties' normal stance on a whole range of issues. And I don't want to stereotype anybody here, but you'll understand the point I'm making, I suspect. And then last but not least, and this point has already been mentioned, there is the question of how far, and I've already touched on this, how far people with religious views should have a voice, but also and I know there are distinguished church people on the Zoom event this evening, how far the church and indeed other religions should act to give a voice to those who don't have it. I mean, it seems to me in London, there are very loud voices. Some people have an easy way of getting their views across, but there are many people, probably millions, who don't get their voice across. And I suspect quite a lot of them are part of the religious part of the population. So I think it does beg a question for church and religious leaders, which is how far they can, within the bounds of the system, work to give a voice through civic society, through civic institutions, to those who traditionally are not represented in the halls of power, town halls, city halls, national government power. So I think that all I say is welcome this report. It's great to understand more about what I consider to be a city of wonderful, a glorious mosaic, as a former mayor of New York once described his city. This is a glorious mosaic, and we should all enjoy it and celebrate it. So thanks for inviting me here this evening.
Tony, thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to our next eminent panelist, Janet Daby, for her responses.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and good evening, everybody. And I'm really pleased to have been invited to this conversation. And I just want to say thank you to Paul and Nathan for putting the report together, really, on religious London and faith in a global city. So I'm Janet Daby, I'm Member of Parliament for Lewisham East, and I'm the new Shadow Minister for Faith, a Labour MP. And it feels very timely, this report, for me, almost as if the report was planned for me, but I'm sure it wasn't. And I found myself in elements of reading it where I found myself agreeing with the findings, or indeed the findings agreeing with me. I myself, I'm from a diverse background, and I represent a diverse constituency, a diverse borough, Lewisham. Tony, you know Lewisham well, because I remember when you came and spoke to us at a cabinet meeting there a few years back. So I'm familiar with you, Tony, to that point. And so very diverse. And so I started to think to myself, you know, in this conversation about this report, what has the Interfaith Forum, what has been happening before the pandemic, and then what's been happening probably since the pandemic? And Nathan's already touched on a lot of points, really, but in an interfaith meeting that I attended just last week to do with the Borough of Lewisham, there was this huge list of all different types of engagements where the church and religious groups had been really significant. And that's in the area of food banks, holiday, hunger programs, cooking skills, doing shopping, drop-offs, prescriptions for neighbours, homeless night shelters, nursery provision, children and youth groups, hospice visits, chaplaincy support, and the list goes on and on and on. And obviously during the pandemic itself, some of those areas of support have drifted away, have stopped. Some are there more partially, and some have become very much stronger. So in the area of food provision and supporting neighbours, they're very much an area where the church has continued to be engaged, but at the same time where the volunteer base has been many older people that have then had to go into shielding, that has affected the volunteering group to some extent. But the study itself shows, which Paul has mentioned, is that religious Londoners are civically minded compared to non-religious people, and Christian leaders and Christian Londoners more specifically will donate to charitable things and will help their neighbours. That's not to say others won't, but a higher percentage of the Christian population will do that, which shows that the religious population is very significant. And then when we think about the austerity that has been taking place since 2010 with cuts to local authority services, the religious organisations have continued to play a significant part in propping up public services. And then when we think back to a lot of the public services we have now, a lot of those foundations come from a Christian thought on this, and the Methodists in terms of building our public services as we know it today. So religious organisations have played a significant part in the past and continue to play a significant part now. But in terms of what Paul was saying, in terms of how they feel valued and their contribution to politics and so on is something else. When I was thinking about post-pandemic, where will the religious organisations need to be focusing, or where will they need to be supporting society, or where will they be pulled on to support society? We think of many people that have lost loved ones, people that have been affected. When somebody passes away, there's so many other lives that are affected, and where people grieve for that loss. And this is something that we'll have to face as we continue to start to face as a country, because many people haven't been able to say goodbye to loved ones or to grieve. I think that that religious organisations will play a part in that, what type of recession we're going into, whether food provision will need to still be available, which I believe it will be, and young people in terms of how they've experienced the pandemic and how that will affects them in terms of their mental health. I think religious organisations will play a part there. To what extent, I'm not sure. The political voice of religious organisations saying that they don't feel that they've necessarily been respected or their beliefs valued. And really, religious organisations need a louder voice, whether that's to do with knowing how to campaign effectively or maybe becoming more involved in politics. I think that's probably the way forward for them. But in politics, I believe that it needs to serve all communities and not have one voice above another. But it also means that the religious organisations need to be actively engaging so that that does happen. As a Labour Party, I think that I don't think we have done God. I think that we have lost many votes from different religious groups, and I think we need to have more of a concerted effort to continue to connect and to make sure that we continue to value people from different with different views and beliefs and values. And I'm going to end with a quote, really. It's actually from the report itself by yourself, Elizabeth. And it is, "London is a place where the religious and non-religious alike can learn to love their neighbours better." And I say that because we've seen people come together during this pandemic in a way which I think we've all valued, whether they're religious or non-religious, and where we've seen a community of people grow and support and help each other. And that's something we need to continue to harness and to encourage, because it makes for a better society. Thank you.
Janet, thank you so much. I feel like in normal circumstances there'd be a little ripple of applause after every speaker. That would be a tiny one. We're going to hand over with no further ado to Mustafa Field.
Great. First, I'd like to thank the team, Paul and Nathan in particular, and also the team behind Theos in putting this report together. It's really, really an informative report, and really, in some ways, someone who's a faith practitioner working with faith communities across London, it really validates our understanding of the context of why faith communities provide a huge contribution to London's communities and civic life in London as well. I think over the last few years, we've seen London is changing in how it engages faith communities and how faith communities are being part of, a lot of the resolve and the resilience that we have in our cities. It's unfortunate after tragic events, be it terrorist attacks, the Grenfell fire, or this current pandemic, we see at the front line, it's faith communities who are stepping up, who are seen to be trusted by many of those who are most vulnerable in our society to provide solutions. The range of food banks, the contribution to the mutual COVID, arrangements in different boroughs and wards has been huge. And that's something that we need to get a real realization. It's almost really interesting, and I don't want to give you more work, Paul and Nathan, but almost catching a snapshot of how, when this research was done, and now, if you were to ask Londoners what they thought about faith, people are much more confident because they've seen how their churches, their gurdwaras, the mosques, the synagogues, and temples have all been active in providing a meaningful contribution to people's life, almost the backbone of very many of our boroughs in London, particularly in providing aid and assistance. And the opportunities are, much more in many ways. Historically, I started my work at the Faith Forum in London in 2013, and often I found myself trying to muscle in within the faith, as a faith sector organization, into stakeholder meetings about London, about recruitment, about diversity. Some almost thinking, why are these faith groups even trying to get in? They're not really doers. They are, the impression, the perception people have of how faith organizations can contribute. There's a really strict negative perception. Almost the secular and mainstream organizations have sometimes failed in understanding the potential and the opportunity that can be gained by bringing in faith communities. And it really, but I mean, I would say that of the last few weeks, we've seen a real change in attitude. And this has been changing over the last few years in many ways. But I think the unfortunate pandemic has shown a boost. Some people, we need faith communities in the room. We need them because they are at the backbone. They are trusted. They are people who may fear to go accessing food banks or getting assistance or being signposted. They are going into faith communities. But faith communities in themselves are a community. They bring people together as a community, and people feel comfortable with that. And that's something that's been really, really interesting. London, I think it is and it's really important to recognize that London is a city that has a strong religious conservative viewpoints. And it's really important that our civic representatives, our politicians understand. And so, yes, we do need to ensure that faith communities understand to engage, but public institutions need to reach out to faith communities, to all community groups in many ways, to understand. And over the last few years, we've seen with austerity and cuts, the provision with engagement with faith from the police, from local authorities, to all, even in terms of diversity of workforce, there has been a decline in engagement and involvement with faith communities. I mean, the report really interesting to see. And this comes up and again, but really strongly demonstrates the charitable initiatives that are conducted by faith communities and the willingness, but also the neighborhood relationships that faith communities, and that's really for me really important as a connected London, a London that neighbors side by side protect each other, and how we saw people across our cities support each other in this pandemic, neighbors reaching out, where in some parts of London, you don't get neighbors who even know each other's names. And so actually, it really is heartwarming to see that it's been an opportunity to connect as Londoners in this very difficult time. I think I just want that faith communities must be seen as an engine for social good, but also ethics and morals, and maybe things that, imams and pastors can say things to parents of young people that youth workers, teachers would never be able to have that conversation. And there is a real strong relationship. But if we want to instill parenting and support parenting, the role of faith leaders in contributing to that space is really valuable. Just like, we know that there are very good youth workers. There are people who are playing really important roles in resident associations, etc. But as I think there is something particularly unique about how faith communities can build. And I think they do build blocks of community, and the youth sector, the potential of unlocking the social capital that faith communities can have with buildings, with space, with institutional support is really, really key. I think colleagues have really highlighted the importance of faith literacy. And I think, if we really want to unlock these community assets, these bases, then we really need to think about ensuring that the public arena understands, what they offer, how you unlock the potential, even, and how do we allocate resources to public, faith groups to continue the essential support they're providing to people who are lonely, to people who are going to be losing their jobs in the next few months. There's a real fear in London that we are going to be the first wave. It's not just going to be with the COVID crisis, but with economic poverty for our communities. And it's faith groups who are stepping up and providing that support, but there is a real challenge around that. I think overall, there is a lot of positives, but I do see that many of the faith communities who are at the forefront, the Black majority churches who are struggling for spaces, often in commercial sites, will be slightly abandoned. They are going to be squeezed financially, and there needs to be policy thought about how do we provide support to diaspora faith buildings, and also particularly the growing Black church community. And there will be reflective discussions on how maybe shared spaces, how we allocate resources to allow them to continue practicing their faith, but also the community space they provide in a London that is going to have less donations to the faith sector.
Mustafa Field, thank you so much. Again, sort of virtual ripple of applause and thanks. Thank you, all three of you panelists, really enriching contributions to that discussion there. I'm going to take the privilege of a chair and kick off with one question of my own, and one that is a kind of summarizing of a theme that's coming through. So Paul, I'm going to ask you to say, what does the data tell us, particularly about age and cohort? I know it says some things about age, and you will have been reading other sources, because one of the findings people are picking up on is the relative youth of particularly frequently practicing religious people in London. And then Nathan, I'm going to come to you next and ask about the thing that I was really struck by today, and you've mentioned, which is this difference between the frequently practicing religious, or particularly the frequently practicing Christian, which is the one that we have the most data for, and the never practicing Christian. And it shows up all over whatever graph you're looking at, you know, whether it's social engagement, whether it's leading a political party. Very often you'll have the never practicing religious, none, and then on like that. And it is the widest gap is between the frequently practicing and the never practicing Christian, which I think is an interesting thing, where a cultural Christian identity and a practicing Christian identity are potentially diverging quite strongly. And that might be making some of our conversations about faith just complicated and inaccurate. So I'm going to go to Paul and then to Nathan, and then I'll come back with a round of questions. At that point, we'll just unmute all you panelists and you can jump in, and I'll collate some more questions for you.
So thank you, Liz. I think the first thing to say is just to confirm that, yes, the data does show that the kind of overall London's religious are comparatively young. So they're kind of disproportionately young, if I could put it like that, i.e. they are younger than the ordinary profile of London. That's partly to do with the youth of the Muslim population. So that's if you broke the data down by different religious categories, then the Muslim population is by far the youngest on average in the whole sample, and that pulls the religious in that direction. But it's also true to say that the Christians, particularly the practicing Christians, and this relates to your other question, the Christians are young in London as well. But that looks more like the kind of ordinary proportion, if you like. So if we're looking to the 18 to 24 category, 15% of London is in that age category in our data. And then you have 14 for the nominal Christians, 18 for the practicing Christians, but then 6 for the non-practicing Christians. So I think there's something there about that second question about how different kind of practicing groups are diverging from each other. But yes, it's very clear in the data, and this is true actually in the wider country as well, that the more practicing you are, then the more likely you are younger, basically. Does that answer?
It does, thank you. Nathan.
I wasn't sure exactly what the question was, but I guess I'll just comment around never practicing and frequently practicing. Well, I think just going back to Paul's point, which he ended with, it's very interesting because I think the general conception is that religion is an old people's kind of interest. It's dying out. The young, the millennials, the Gen Z don't really have anything to do with that. But I think the data is clearly showing that we have a not insignificant section of the population, the young, who are actually engaged. So there's clearly something going on in I think fair to talk mainly about the Muslim community and also the Christian community that is capturing the imagination of the young and therefore that's something worth looking at. What is doing that? Also interesting to see there's still quite a strong kind of Christian nominalism or religious nominalism, an attachment to religious identity, and I think there's interesting to explore connections with cultural identity and what kind of associations people have when they associate with Christianity. Yeah, I think you're right to mention that there will be a point where these will diverge. I think my expectation, based on what we've seen in the data, is that the never practicing Christians will at some point probably completely abandon the whole association with Christianity because their values will be just closer to kind of just secular values, and the frequently practicing Christians will have to kind of make up their mind, in a sense, whether they sit on some of these issues. So I'm afraid that's all I can say at this point.
That's absolutely fine. And a few people have been asking about the effects of the pandemic. We did rerun. So this data was, the quantitative research was done in January. It was due to launch in March, just before the election of the London mayor. That all got slightly scuppered, which is why we're launching it now in June. But in the meantime, we did rerun a few of those core questions, and they stayed largely the same. So at that point, we have not seen a significant enough effect of the pandemic to be showing up in the data. We are doing different polling asking about the effects of the pandemic, which we hope to be launching later in the year. But at that stage, there was no change. I am going to ask about, forgive me, I am going to ask Janet to answer a question, which is, how can political parties do God more? I'm going to ask Tony, what's your perception of whether policymakers treat religion as a kind of privatized issue, and that the idea of engaging on this kind of more ongoing, less crisis-led scale, is that too big a change to expect? Or are you seeing, like Mustafa seems to be seeing, more openness towards it? Or are you perhaps seeing growing nervousness? Who knows? So we're going to go to Janet and then to Tony.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So how can politicians, political parties do God more? I think, my thoughts are very much that politicians, we like to go to events, we like to meet people, we like to be known by people, and we like to know what an idea of where we need to make policies and where there needs to be legislative change. And I think sometimes with when it comes to religious organisations, and dare I say this, but it's like many politicians will enjoy being centre stage and saying the right things, and therefore being able to win over the sense that people are going to vote for that political party. And I feel that we need to go further than that as politicians. It is right to go to events, to speak, to get to know constituents, but I think we need to do more to do with listening to religious organisations. We need to listen to what different religious groups are saying and where they'd like to have a voice and where they'd like to make change. And I mean, the bit that I read in your study was saying that Londoners feel marginalised and threatened because of their religious background, beliefs or identity, and they feel that governments have passed legislation which makes life more difficult for people with their beliefs. And that resonates with me to some extent, because I can't remember who else, I think it was it Nathan was also saying that many religious organisations felt that they were there to maybe as the last resort to public services. And I think religious organisations need more prominence, to be more in the forefront, to have more of a voice and to feel more valued. And so that goes with politicians reaching out and appreciating the perspective that faith organisations come from, and embracing them more, as well as religious groups and faith organisations having a voice and knowing how to push themselves forward. I don't know if you've heard of the phrase being a pushy parent. I think we need, churches sometimes need to be pushy in making sure they have a political voice.
Thank you. Tony, over to you, and any related reflections about that, particularly that relationship about local government authorities and faith groups, and what your feeling is about the future for it.
I think it's fair to say, and I defer to Janet, who is an actual politician. So, I think that for a number of years, politics hasn't really known how to handle religion. I mean, it's intriguing. We live in a country where, the head of state is the supreme governor of the Church of England, and where the heir to the throne has explicitly wanted himself to be seen as reacting to all faiths in the United Kingdom. So there's a sort of very visible leading from the top there, which I often think the royal family have an incredibly good sense of what's going on, and they know how to adapt to the way the country is changing and the city is changing. So I think politicians are much more relaxed now than they would have been 20 or 30 years ago with faith and the impact of people's faith, religion inside politics. I think they absolutely are. But as I come back to something I said earlier, I think the big question facing faith leaders, church leaders and other faith leaders is how to be, because I think if they get involved in party politics, it's no good. It's just not going to work. Just aggravate all the other people who aren't of the particular part. I mean, it's not to say individual people who are members of church or other religions can't be politically active. Of course they can. But I think for the church, for churches and religions themselves, aligning with particular political parties is bad, will be very bad. And what they need to do is to find a way of being political, but without being party political. And I think that's where it is easy to be political without being party political. And I think that's where church leadership and other religious leadership here represented needs to think harder itself because politicians, I'll shut up and going on too long, politicians, and Janet knows this better than me, respond to the voices they hear. And the more people say to them, heaven knows how many emails a day you get, Janet, a week, a year, must be a large number.
Just over the Black Lives Matter weekend, it went up to 1,100. So it depends.
There we are. So, MPs get a lot of communication, councillors do too. So I think in that sense, people, those who are personally religious, who are leading religions, need to get in on that sort of visible game, be heard.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask, we've got quite a lot of questions about what is appropriate, what is best practice for this kind of engagement, because I'm nervous that perhaps being a bit too rosy tinted about this tonight, and we are at Theos incredibly pro the engagement of religious groups, civil society as a whole in our common life. But there are obviously risks, there are ways of doing it really badly. So I'm going to ask Mustafa and then Paul, who's written a couple of other reports which are much more specific recommendations about what does the good engagement look like, to speak into that question. And then I'm going to open up, because there's a real sense coming out of that never practicing / nominal religious, which we think is vast majority Christian, the relationship between that with the growing kind of nationalism, English nationalism, nationalist populism. And, we've written a little bit on that around using of Christian symbols and Christian imagery around nationalist sentiment, but perhaps that not being rooted in church attendance. If anyone would like to jump in on that, I'd be grateful. So we're going to go to Mustafa and then Paul, and then you can volunteer yourselves.
I think, in politics, it manifests itself in very different ways. But I think what's really, really important and meaningful, and we see faith communities best establish themselves at, local community engagement, providing local solutions and addressing issues and challenges that you're finding in local communities. That could include challenges around how we instill a greater partnership between the police, for example, between schools, understanding some of the needs around welfare support and provision, and making sure that faith leaders, number one, are able to coordinate resources at this space. And we've seen many good examples of, important change. Citizens UK has been very active with London Citizens across in mobilizing faith communities and community groups of different diaspora communities and bringing change for more fairness and justice in London. We've been involved in Space from London through the Faiths United campaign and talking about how we can raise awareness around social distancing as lockdown is being, is opening up. Actually, it's really important that we make sure people still are conscious, as government wants to encourage people to get back to business, but also maintain social distancing. That balance is really hard to strike. And it's really important. I think faith communities can fill that vacuum in moral guidance and challenges around how we address some of the social, political problems, economic problems that we have outside that space.
Thank you. Paul.
So I would agree with a lot of what Mustafa said, and just say, I think there could be a distinction between engagement, which is kind of brokered by a public authority in a very sort of managed way, and sometimes that's helpful. I'm not denigrating that, but a lot of boroughs have, for instance, a system of ecumenical deans, basically representatives of different parts of the Christian and wider religious community, and they will invite them in and see them and give them a kind of afternoon tea a couple of times a year and that kind of thing, which is all to the good and keeps that kind of oil of relationships going. But it's and it can help on some of the social issues as well, where churches are being active around running food bank or holiday provision, as Janet was talking about earlier. But that's one-way traffic. I think often if you wait for the council to come and invite you to discuss an issue, then you might be waiting a long time. And there's something about what emerges from the grassroots as well. And London Citizens, I have to say, is a fantastic example of that. And I, as a church leader, I'm locally involved in London Citizens and really champion grassroots organising, because what that does is it does allow that kind of political engagement, which isn't party political, and it brings together diverse religious communities. So one of the problems, one of the fears that people might have about what religious involvement in public and political life, whether that's local, national level, is that it will become atavistic, divisive, it will be very self-interested, and it will be sectarian, it will damage the interests of other communities. So you have to find ways of mediating. So whether that's at a sort of ecumenical level within the churches, that's what we're saying. Churches need to work really hard on building relationships between each other. And that happens sometimes, but it doesn't always happen. And also you need to be really hard at kind of creating that, I suppose sociologists would call it bridging capital. And there are models out there. London Citizens is one. I'm sure there are others. And it's really important that that's how it, or at least should I say, that's how it will work well in London. In the worst case scenario, you have individual communities kind of fighting for their own corner, which sometimes, there's got to be a space for that. But generally speaking, it's going to work best when it's something that religious communities do together, and therefore working on relationships between each other is absolutely key.
Thank you. Would anyone like to?
Could I?
Yes,
Could I,
please.
Elizabeth? I mean, Paul's really answered that superbly, and to politically engage, you do need a strategy. It does need a level of coordination. I could see going in the chat was whether you have to align yourself to a political party or not. I think that's down to your preference. You do have more of a voice if you do come together in a group or a group of churches, a religious group, whatever however that may work for them. But one of the things Paul said is there is local politics and national politics. And some of the strategies are very similar, but you need to learn about how to campaign really, and also the political process. And some of it can be quite straightforward in terms of writing letters, lobbying, doing petitions, and so on. But you have to prioritise what it is you want to focus on, that you feel strongly enough about, that you're going to see this through, and be like a bit like a dog with a bone, really. Don't let go. Thanks. That's it.
Thank you. I'm going to leave that nationalism one hanging because I think we're all thinking.
I am quite happy to stick my oar in on that one, Liz.
Go on then, Paul. Stick your oar in.
I suppose we wrote the reports, so it's not precisely sticking our oar in. But I think there are hints of that in the data. So there are hints in that non-practicing but religious identifying category of a sort of lean, but it's hints only. And I say one of the breadcrumbs that sort of leads in that direction is that question on political correctness, where you see then a divergence between the kind of non-practicing religious groups and their, the non-practicing Christian group and their response to that, which they very strongly agreed with that. And then the other religious group, which didn't really agree with that at all, and the non-religious didn't really agree with that. And then also there was difference there between the practicing and the non-practicing Christian. So I think there are hints of that in the data, but I wouldn't look at this data and panic that there was a kind of religious nationalism speaking to us through this data. I think there probably is a little bit of that. But looking at this data, I wouldn't say it's something that's sort of leaping out and grabbing our attention.
Thank you. I'm going to go round the 5 panelists, and I'm going to ask you in 1 minute to say, what do you think is the one thing that would, related to this area, make it more likely that London will thrive in the next 6 months, a year, given what we're learning about actually how deeply different London is from the rest of the country, and in lots of ways how deeply different, the deep differences in that Charles Taylor phrase we see even within our communities. What would help it thrive? I'm looking for one line. This is a challenge I'm springing on you with no warning, and it seems fairest to make my own colleagues go first. So I'm going to ask Nathan, because he was the last one speaking, and Paul, and then we'll go in the same order: Tony, Janet, and Mustafa, and then we'll bring this bit to a close, and those who want to can stay for a bit more relationship building.
Just because this report is very heavy on the data and on very detailed questions, I'm going to veer towards the I think wrongly called fluffy things. And I'm going to stress the importance of dispositions and active practices of listening. I know that's fluffy, and I think this is the crisis of this moment, that we've kind of abandoned this language, this moral language, this language of morality and the virtues and the dispositions for technocratic and for other forms of language. I think this is really important. So a disposition of listening at all levels, I think, is absolutely crucial. From the local level, between individual churches and church leaders and members, getting to know their neighbors, to all the different structures up to the highest political order. An active listening and active curiosity, I think, will get us quite far.
Thank you. More than one line, but you can get away with it. Paul.
It's tempting to answer in one word and say vaccine.
I mean, you can have that. That's fine.
So I could spool on a bit more. I think one of the really important things is to understand what a city is. So when we have a conversation about London, we're often talking about the economy. In the next 12 to 18 months, that's going to go through severe disruption. But we need to pay a lot of attention to the social ecology of London, the religious ecology. A city isn't just a money-making machine. It is also a community, and it's really important to kind of tend to that well.
Tony.
I think religious leaders, and indeed people who are personally religious, can probably help in trying to soften the edges of the series of separate, often overlapping culture wars that appear to be breaking out all over public life. I will name none in particular. You can take your choice. There's a range of them out there, and I just think that because religions often don't have a particular line on many of these culture wars, they're better placed than some of the stuff that rages on the social media to have a sort of calming view on things.
Thank you. Janet.
In the context of this report, what we have seen, we've seen religious groups and non-religious groups come together, NHS, the clapping. We've seen religious groups come together to do with delivering food and responding to each other. So I think we do need to, people do need to listen to each other, but we do need a strategy for change as well. But we also need to look for those things that we have in common, because we very much do need cohesion in our society.
Thank you. And Mustafa.
I'm a localist, so I'm going to say that I think COVID has really allowed us to work beyond the walls of our churches, to reach out to other communities. And often there's a real fear and stigma, fear of proselytization and other factors of engaging with faith communities. And for us to unlock that, unlock our potential, I think interfaith is a really good way of breaking down barriers and engaging with the secular and mainstream world when we do it together. And I think that's something that we should almost put as an agenda item of those who are running faith institutions, is how do we build alliances with people from different faiths and beliefs?
Mustafa, thank you so much. I'm going to show the beautiful printed version of the report, which is available to order. It might take a little bit longer than normal because the boxes and the people and the postage are all in different parts of the country, and we are, after all, not Amazon. But I would recommend getting hold of it if you'd like a copy. And I'm just going to read you the end of T.S. Eliot, the end of the T.S. Eliot quote that bookends the report, which is from Choruses from the Rock. And the stranger says, "What is the meaning of this city? Do you huddle close together because you love each other? What will you answer? We'll dwell together to make money from each other. Or this is a community." Thank you so much for coming. That is the end of the formal part of the evening. In a moment.